Okay, I think we have critical mass. Let's get started. It is a pleasure to welcome you all to today's discussion on place names, boundaries, and real-world impacts, the story of Upper Roxbury, hosted by the Boston University Initiative on Cities and the Norman B. Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. Thank you so much to today's speakers for taking the time to be with us and to our audience. Just a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website and YouTube channel. My name is Catherine Lusk. I serve as the co-director of the BU Initiative on Cities. I have to start by thanking Madeline Webster, a doctoral student at BU and one of today's panelists, who conceived of this event and assembled a fantastic panel of experts you'll hear from today. Thank you so much, Maddie, for your partnership. Today's event is also part of our recurring series on race, place, and space, created jointly with the BU Arts Initiative and BU Diversity and Inclusion. Our next event in this series, scheduled for March 15th, is called How Culture and Creativity Build Power in Communities of Color. We'll put the registration into the chat so you have that if you want to join us on the 15th. Now I have the pleasure of introducing today's moderator, Garrett Nelson. Garrett is a historical geographer and president and head curator of the Leventhal Center. Hi, Garrett. Where he leads efforts to engage the public with new programs and digital tools that emphasize the role of geographic knowledge in the politics of place. His current book project, The Limits of Here, look at reformers' efforts to redefine geographic units in Boston and New England. And with that, Garrett, I turn it over to you. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks to everybody who's tuned in today for this really exciting roundtable. As Catherine said, my name is Garrett Nelson. I'm the president head curator at the Leventhal Map and Education Center, which, if you're not familiar with it, is an independent research and education center inside of the Boston Public Library. We're located at the Central Library in Copley Square, where we steward the library's nearly 250,000 maps, geographic objects, and other materials that help tell stories about people and places in the past, present, and future. I'm really thrilled that we could partner with the Institute on Cities for this particular event, because one of our real goals with our collection, our free programs, and our free exhibitions at the Leventhal Center is to think about the ways that maps are not just these kind of static, unproblematic documents of where people live or where roads and boundaries are located, but instead to think about the way they invite us into many different stories, some deep in the past and some much more recent, about how places have been contested and fought over time, and how they form a major axis of people's identity, their political communities, and how they see themselves fitting into a larger world. I'm joined today by a really amazing set of panelists, really the three of the people who you would most want with you to examine a question like this about the history of Roxbury. And so I'll ask all of them to join us in just a moment. First is Byron Rushing. Byron is a former Massachusetts state representative where he served from 1983 to 2018. And he is also the president of the Roxbury Historical Society. While in office, his priorities were civil and human rights, local community, economic and housing development, and housing and healthcare for all, with a particular emphasis on anti-apartheid efforts in South Africa and rights for LGBTQ residents. Hi, Byron. Great to have you here. Also joining us is Madeline Webster, who, as Catherine noted, really helped to spearhead and bring together this panel today. Madeline is a PhD candidate at Boston University, where she studies urban history and historic preservation with a focus on Boston. She's also the Public Research Fellow in History and Geography at the Leventhal Center this year, where she's helping us work on our forthcoming exhibition, More or Less in Common: Environment and Justice in the Human Landscape. Madeline's dissertation explores Black Bostonians' historic preservation efforts from the late 19th century onward. Hi, Maddie.
Hi, Garrett, thanks.
And finally, Yahoo Miller is joining us. Yahoo is the senior editor at the Bay State Banner, which is New England's longest running Black-owned newspaper. He's covered areas including politics, public policy, education, and real estate development since he began writing in 1993. He's worked in state government and the nonprofit sector. Miller grew up in Roxbury and currently lives in the Grove Hall section of the neighborhood. Hi, Yahoo.
Hey, Garrett.
So before we get started, I also want to remind everybody, we very much welcome questions and comments on today's roundtable, and we want it to be as interactive as possible. You should feel free at any time to drop a question or a note in the Q&A section of Zoom. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible. And I'm sure if we don't get to all of them, there'll be an opportunity to follow up on social media or online later. I wanted to start the discussion out by asking each of our panelists to say a little bit about why this matters. Why are we asking a question that's more than just a trivia question about where's the edge of Roxbury and where does it turn into Dorchester? Or where does it turn into West Roxbury? Where does it turn into its other neighboring towns and communities? I want to frame the question that way because on the one hand, it seems like we should be able to get a pretty simple answer to the question of where is Roxbury? Where does Roxbury begin? Where does Roxbury end? As I'm walking around Boston, when am I in Roxbury and when am I not in Roxbury? It seems like we should be able to answer that question just by looking at a map, of which we have many hundreds showing Roxbury and the Boston region in the Leventhal Center collections. But it turns out that both the way we would answer that question and the consequences that it has on our real lives are much more complicated. We actually don't really know where Roxbury begins and Roxbury ends, and that's true of any place. We tend to talk about things like Boston or Massachusetts or Roxbury or the United States as if they just existed in the real world automatically without any social, political processes making them happen. And in fact, in reality, geographic units are much more complicated. They have histories, they emerge out of particular situations in the past, and they're constantly undergoing continued negotiations. So I'll start with Byron, and then we'll turn it over to Madeline and finally Yahoo to bring us into this question. Why does it matter? Why is this more than just a question of where some cartographers drew a line on a map? How does this question affect the world of both Roxbury residents and people living elsewhere in Boston?
And of course, that's a great question, and that's why we're here. And I think that for many places, they have objective boundaries, right? If you want to vote for mayor of Boston, you have to live in Boston, right? And so you know when you're not in Boston, you go to your polling place and that you can't vote for the mayor, you're not in Boston. And Roxbury is a combination of both a place with objective boundaries, and then of course all the ways that people see it and talk about it right now. It has objective boundaries because, like most of Boston, it was politically independent of Boston. So you can get a map of the boundaries of Roxbury that in 1867 voted to annex themselves to the city of Boston, and so that for me would be the objective boundaries of Roxbury. But of course, there are places in Roxbury that people want to call something else for a variety of reasons. And I think that one of the pieces that I'd like to focus on, apart from just where the objective, is why the differences. And then what do the differences mean to the people who disagree with the people who say this is Jamaica Plain, right? And then of course, in this city, because of its long history of race being such a factor, I would give as an example the Boston Globe and how they report what happens in what I would call Roxbury. So in 1969, a church on Humboldt Avenue, Mount Pleasant Missionary Baptist, celebrated its 80th anniversary, and it was a big deal. They got a nice puff piece in the Globe with a picture, and the Senator Markey came to the celebration. He had his picture in the Globe and meeting the minister, and it was all through the article described as being in Dorchester. This church on Humboldt Avenue was described as being in Dorchester. Well, maybe, except the next week, there was a shooting on Humboldt Avenue, and it was reported in the Globe. And when the Globe reported it, it said there was a shooting that occurred around the corner from a playground in Roxbury. That playground in Roxbury is 2 blocks away on Humboldt Avenue from the church that was reported as being in Dorchester. What does that mean? And what does it mean both for the people who are in Roxbury, the people who are on Humboldt Avenue, and then people outside that don't know the community when they read about these stories?
Excellent. Thanks, Byron. Maddie, would you like to share an answer to this question?
Yes, thanks, Byron, for that. I will give an anecdote that has to deal with why I, kind of was thinking about place names and boundaries to begin with, and how that shaped the chapter that I'm writing. It's because I was looking at the Washington Park Urban Renewal Program, from the early 1960s. And I was trying to figure out a way to kind of to look at this history. And what I wanted to do is expand it backward in time. So give the context dating from the late 19th century to show how we got to this urban renewal program. And I was confused at first why the area above Seaver Street, so above Franklin Park, all the way up to what is now Nubian Square, and between Washington Street and Warren Street, why that's all the Washington Park area and all the Washington Park neighborhood of Roxbury now. And I was wondering, Washington Park is it is now Malcolm X Park. It's all the way up towards Nubian Square. Why is the area north of Seaver Street also Washington Park? And I thought, oh, well, of course, urban planners putting a name on a space that has really nothing to do with how people living farther towards Franklin Park felt about the space. They went to Horatio Harris Park. That was the key park for them in Franklin Park. So I looked into it, and I was interested that, for people who know the story, they kind of understand that the middle class Black Bostonians living in Upper Roxbury were really concerned with making sure that urban renewal money, particularly rehabilitation money, came to their part of Roxbury. And it was them who wanted to make sure that the original Washington Park urban renewal plan extended south of Townsend Street. Originally, it wasn't going to be including south of Townsend Street. And that is now why Washington Park includes so much of Upper Roxbury. And it's not just about that top-down urban planner ideas. Of course, it was still top-down from the middle class, sort of projecting and sculpting the lives of lower or working class Black Bostonians. But just to think about how shifting boundaries and place names that we have today, there was this really crucial history behind it. And it matters today. And I'll turn it over to Yahoo.
Great, thanks, Maddie. Yahoo?
So about a year after I was born, 1967, my family moved from Cambridge, where we'd been living, to Roxbury, which is where my father grew up. And that happened to be the same year that the post office changed the designation for 02121 to Dorchester. So we lived on Ruthven Street, and the post office called it Dorchester. At that time, everybody knew that was Roxbury. I grew up in Roxbury and then moved to JP in Dorchester, and then came back to Roxbury in 2010. Me and my partner bought a house on Crawford Street, which is a block over from Ruthven. And so, we both grew up in Roxbury and we consider that area to still be Roxbury because the post office designation is just arbitrary. But I addressed my mail and always recorded my addresses like 02121 Dorchester, just sort of, I don't want any confusion, okay? My partner put down Boston because she refused to identify with Dorchester. And so a couple years ago, she got rear-ended, and we both have the same insurance company. I called the insurance company, or actually they called me because my number's on all their paperwork, and they said that she was committing insurance fraud because she said she was in Boston. You're not in Boston, you're in Dorchester. So that started a very long circular argument about no, we're not in Dorchester, we're in Roxbury. Roxbury's a part of Boston. I explained that my cousin lives in Fayston, Vermont. His mailing address is Waitsfield, but he pays taxes, went to school, and votes in Fayston. Post office designations are arbitrary. It just went around and around and around. She's now paying a higher insurance rate. She's actually saved thousands of dollars by putting Boston on her insurance forms. But now she's paying the same rate that I'm paying because her, the adjuster changed the paperwork. I mean, that whole argument, though, was really because the post office changed that boundary arbitrarily. But it actually shows like one of the really small ways that it costs you, like these designations can cost you money. That are, I think we've all seen real estate brokers, saying this is on the Jamaica Plain line, this is on the Fort Hill line, this is Fort Hill, when it's not Fort Hill, not the Fort Hill section of Roxbury. And of course, whenever, there's a shooting, it's a Roxbury man, or, I think that for decades now, not just the Globe, but all, the white news media has used neighborhood designations as a racial designator because they don't want to say a black man did such and such. Most recently, so I mean, in the 80s and 90s, white people still thought of Dorchester as a white neighborhood. So they'd say, shooting in Roxbury, and you'd look and you'd say, okay, that's Upham's Corner, that's Dorchester. It's always been Dorchester since 1630, but Roxbury, man. All right. Now that people recognize Dorchester as like a racially heterogeneous neighborhood that, where there's a lot of black people and there's crime there. There's a shooting in the South Shore Mall a few weeks back. The suspect was apprehended. The suspect who's been charged in the shooting is from Maynard, Massachusetts. The headline, shooting suspect apprehended in Dorchester. So, it's just like you can't, like the news media can't escape like that kind of using a neighborhood as a proxy for race. So those are some of the reasons why I've been in dialogue with Byron for more than 20 years around these issues.
Great. I mean, so
right. The Banner is probably the only newspaper in Boston that gets it right. Right. Every time the Globe does one of these, the Globe reporters, with the crime blotter seems to have the boundaries right. Right. but that's the only place that's found. Right.
It's interesting within even the answers that you all gave, right? There's so many ways that different institutions or types of people define a place, right? Byron, you talked about the legal status of Boston as a municipality. Where can you vote and where can you not vote? You talked about newspaper reporters. Maybe it's different if you're looking at the crime desk versus if you're looking at the reporting. Yahoo, you talked about both the post office's boundaries as well as the insurance companies' underwriting boundaries, whatever they use behind the scenes. Maddie, you talked about the BRA's legal definition around an area to designate it as an urban renewal area, and then of course floating all around this is our just conventional perceptions of when we think about a place like Roxbury, what place are we thinking about, and how does that immediately connote with the way that place has been tied to the social context of who lives in it. Could you all take us back a little bit? So before Roxbury, as we know it today, kind of emerged as a both social and geographic entity. Byron, you talked about how Roxbury, unlike something like, for instance, the South End, used to have its own independent legal status. It used to be a town all unto itself. How does, when we think about Roxbury, historic Roxbury, 18th and 19th century Roxbury, tell us a little bit about how that plays, if at all, into contemporary definitions of what Roxbury is.
I think that there is certainly a definition that is related both to history but also to pride. So when things, when they're good stories, right, and they're important buildings, important institutions, then people want those institutions that are objectively in Roxbury to be talked about as being in Roxbury. So I think that if you go, when I look back, what I see is a history where Roxbury, just before the Civil War, when they split, because Roxbury split, and West Roxbury decided it didn't want that most people in Roxbury, the part of Roxbury closest to Boston, was getting too urban, too crowded, not rural enough, and was moving into a different kind of politics. So they took 2/3 of Roxbury and called it West Roxbury and set up a town. And so the Roxbury that comes to become part of Boston in 1868 is that part of Roxbury after West Roxbury split off. And they saw themselves as a relatively prosperous and coherent community, even though they were a community of rich people and very poor people. But they just saw them as poor Roxburyites and rich Roxburyites. And that seemed to go on for a while until race came into it, until Black people start to move into the area. West Roxbury, of course, becomes part of Boston also, about 20 years after Roxbury. That's a lot bigger geography. And they, of course, have to start figuring out how they define themselves. They, unlike Dorchester, decided that the West Roxbury name would go to the richest part of that rural area. And even we heard that just in preparing for this talk, right? Places like Roslindale, sometimes there were like villages in West Roxbury. They then became significant parts of the neighborhood. The interesting thing about this map, right? You look at the map of West Roxbury and the map of Roxbury, when West Roxbury separates, the boundary is Seaver Street. You see, right now, if West Roxbury had a different racial history, it would be one of the most diverse neighborhoods in Boston if it used its original boundaries of West Roxbury.
So yeah, I've had many discussions with Byron about those historical boundaries. I've gone back to maps from the 1600s and the 1800s and sort of looked at the lines. And it's it's a really tough call. Like, how are you going to draw a line around this area and say it's Roxbury and what, because for instance, Jamaica Plain was never a separate political entity. It was always a neighborhood of Roxbury, as was what's now Rosendale. The line where Roxbury and West Roxbury split off along Seaver Street is a firm political boundary, but I don't want to cede Franklin Park to Jamaica Plain, and I don't think anybody in Roxbury does. So I think that I respect Byron's lines, but there are certain sections of Roxbury I won't cede. I think that the boundary with Dorchester on the east is one of the more interesting ones because it followed a brook for a lot of it. And the brook is now paved over. I don't think there's any water flow there. I think the everything being paved is sort of disrupted the drainage system there. But you can still see the trace of it. You can still see the depression. Like if you're walking down a street that goes between Blue Hole Ave, which is entirely in Roxbury, and Columbia Road, which is in Dorchester, you can see a depression in the street where the drainage was, where that stream ran. You can see Brook Ave, which ran along the Dorchester side of the brook, and Brook Ford Street, which, presumably at one point there was a ford in the Dorchester Brook there. And, it's really that line, that dividing line is really just about 20 or 30 meters from Blue Hole Avenue. So that area between Blue Hole Ave and Columbia Road is mostly Dorchester. The Martin Luther King School is Dorchester. But yeah, over time, as as Roxbury became Black, as those institutions became Blacker, organizations like DSNI, which is historically on the Dorchester side of the line, considers itself to be in Roxbury. one thing that I found profoundly disturbing that Byron pointed out was that looking at the map when Roxbury was annexed to Boston, much of what we consider Lower Roxbury is actually historically in Boston or the South End. So we in Roxbury have long looked at Massachusetts Avenue as a dividing line, and a lot of what's on our side of Massachusetts, all of what's on our side of Massachusetts Avenue is the South End, all the way down to nearly to Melnia Gas Boulevard. So, but the Museum of Fine Arts, Northeastern University, which never uses Roxbury in any of its identification, news media, says, Northeastern University's encroaching on Roxbury. It's almost entirely, if not, no, it's entirely in Roxbury. It's encroaching on residential areas in Roxbury, but yeah, it is really fascinating to look at the racial and sometimes religious considerations that have changed the designation of where Roxbury is, where Dorchester is, where the South End is.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, there is a direct chronological connection between Black people moving into Roxbury and white Protestants calling Mission Hill, Mission Hill. Mm-hmm. Mission Hill was a nickname that Roman Catholics gave to Parker Hill after they built a church there. The church became famous because miracles were being performed there in that basilica. And if you read the history, the Roman Catholic history of the church, they talk about buying this estate in Roxbury on Parker Hill. And that's in the first paragraph of the history of that church. And over the years, of course, there's a shift. And Mission Hill means white, so that when they get a public housing project, and public housing was segregated in Boston at the beginning. And so they build the Mission Hill public housing project. Then as Black people move in, they decide that they need to expand Mission Hill public housing project. And so they build more public housing across the street from that, across Parker Street from that, and they call it Mission Hill Extension. And Mission Hill Extension is all Black. Across the street is Mission Hill, all white, public housing.
So tell us, I'm curious for you to say more, but not just about the outer boundaries of Roxbury, but then how within Roxbury, whether it's this much larger 19th century Roxbury or a geographically smaller contemporary Roxbury, how then do we start thinking about neighborhoods within neighborhoods, this kind of nested units? I think that's one of the things that's oftentimes trips people up about Boston is we hear the term neighborhoods and we assume that you can just draw these, lines and you're either in one neighborhood or you're in another. But of course, Boston has both places like Roxbury or Dorchester, which used to be large independent cities that have been annexed into the city. And then even within those areas, there are sub-neighborhoods, some of which have some form of legal definition and others of which are just kind of a feeling amongst residents or a conventional term. So as we think about inside of Roxbury, how does Roxbury itself, where do the terms Lower and Upper Roxbury come from? Where are the terms for the different pieces of Roxbury itself? And how do those also relate to this racialized history, which, as you've been highlighting, is so important for understanding the 20th century cultural definition of Roxbury?
And I think it's almost always people moving around, people in other parts of Roxbury naming the part of Roxbury they're not in. And so it's sort of like, on one level, it's just topology of the shape. So most of Roxbury is on hills, but there are parts of Roxbury that are literally flat. And so the flat part got called Lower, the hilly part got called Upper. Though originally, I think if you look at the earliest definition I've seen for the name for the upper part was the Highlands. So for a long time, all of the highland of Roxbury was just called the Highlands. And then, of course, that seemed to have been too big. It hit that those neighborhood names had to be divided up, and they were. And so part of it became Highland Park. And again, in people's minds, there was always a definition, though it didn't always agree. But generally, everybody agreed on what the middle of what it was. It was the boundaries that you had problems with.
Yeah, I mean, in the 1950s, if you were making a phone call, you'd say, operator, give me Highlands 2, 1296 or Highlands 50717. I mean, those numbers 44 or 442, 445 were considered Roxbury Highlands designations. So people were using that term then. From what I understand from going to like Roxbury reunions and stuff, people referred to the hill and in town. The distinctions, to the extent that there were distinctions, Malcolm X referring to the area as Sugar Hill, said it was a class distinction between people who lived on the hill, where there were a lot of larger, single family, 2-family, 3-family homes versus in town, where it was all apartment buildings. If you lived in Madison Park or around Shawmut Avenue, Madison Park, Roy Haynes, the jazz drummer, Vinnie Haynes and Michael Haynes, who was a state legislator, grew up there. Billy Sylvester. I mean, a lot of people grew up in that area, had a really strong sense of identity before it was destroyed during urban renewal to make way for what's now Madison Park High School. Louis Farrakhan grew up on Shawmut Ave and what was considered in town at that time, or Lower Roxbury. Yeah, I mean, I think there, those are the main distinctions, like in town, or the high or the hill or the highlands. But in my lifetime, though, the last 55 years, I've never really heard people in my age cohort like just use those designations. It's just Roxbury, with a really kind of amorphous sense of where that is and where it ends. A lot of people in my generation go by what the post office says, including mayoral candidate Tito Jackson said, it's on the border. And when he says that, like, so the old folks in Roxbury, including me, are like, your blood's starting to boil. No, you're a quarter mile from the border, but yeah.
And the one thing to elaborate on what Yahoo is saying is that I found in my research looking at newspapers from the 1930s, from the Chronicle, the Guardian, 1930s, 40s, 50s, is that the interesting thing is it's like now it's the Dorchester Roxbury line. That's the big debate. Back then, it was really trying to differentiate oneself, who was someone from the Hill, who was in town. And it wasn't just the Hill versus in town. I was looking through some oral histories from people living who were like middle schoolers in the 30s on the Hill. And there's this one woman, Ellen Jackson, who you might have heard of. She was mentioning, it wasn't just the Hill. There was the Upper Hill and there was the Lower Hill. So from about Monroe Street, around that area would be geographically north of Townsend Street. They were a bit different. They were the Lower Hill, but the Upper Hill past Townsend Street up there, that was a slightly different crowd, and it really mattered. And one of the reasons it really mattered is that, because of discrimination when it came to jobs that people could have, there were, a Pullman porter, but considered a pretty good job. There were Pullman porters in town in Lower Roxbury, and there were Pullman porters up on the Hill. There were lawyers in too, but there were also Pullman porters who owned their own houses. And to distinguish oneself as up on the Hill, a Pullman porter on the Hill with one's own house, that bit of cachet, that status was like really, really important to the sense of self, because the boundaries really between classes were so porous, just as they were, on the landscape.
And
of course,
all the time Malcolm X spent in Roxbury was on the Hill. Like, he didn't live in town.
Right. And of course, I will take this opportunity to admit that I was wrong about when the Sugar Hill, not only the hill, but where the sugar came from. And I have always suggested that was actually originated in Malcolm's autobiography. And Maddie has helped me with that one. And so I am publicly announcing that I was wrong and that there are references to Sugar Hill before Malcolm in Black newspapers. Usually not in a usually in a denigrating way, you know, that these people think they're so fancy. These Negroes up there think they're so fancy. And also we need to also point out that we in Roxbury, upper and lower are reversed. Lower does not mean south. See, it's just flatter, right? So Lower Roxbury is north of the hill.
It's interesting how some of these distinctions are very much dependent on who's talking to each other, right? And whether the goal is to differentiate. So, you know, you've just talked about class differentiations within the mid 20th century Black community of upper and lower, you know, where people were living and how that fit into a class system versus solidarity and togetherness, right? Are we trying to sort of connect people and say they're all together? And sometimes that happens externally, looking from the outside. You know, you talked about how the newspapers like the Globe just treat all of Roxbury as if it were a single homogeneous racial place formation and use it as a kind of byword for that. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the ways in which claiming a geographic identity isn't always enforced from outside, but sometimes allows people to say, hey, this is our place, this is our identity, this is who we are, we're connected to this place and we're claiming it, we're using it as a way to come together and to define a common identity?
Well, that certainly happened in Lower Roxbury, because Lower Roxbury was one of the poorest parts of Roxbury, and the city had decided that they really wanted it to be gone. There were lots of plans for other things other than residential housing to have in Lower Roxbury. And then that culminated with the decision to build I-95 and then to have a road that would connect I-95 to the Southeast Expressway, which is where Melnea Cass Boulevard is now. That decision meant that a tremendous amount of the housing was going to be torn down in Lower Roxbury. When the first boundaries were drawn for the South End Urban Renewal area, it was called the South End Urban Renewal Area, and the southern boundary of that was going to be what was going to be the Crosstown Highway, right? So they just assumed there was nothing going to be there, so we'll make that the boundary of the Urban Renewal District. When Black people began to organize in Lower Roxbury, one of the things they objected to was the name of the South End Urban Renewal Area, and it got changed to the South End Lower Roxbury Urban Renewal Area. And then when they finally got enough organized sufficiently that they were able to defeat the Boston Redevelopment Authority's plans for the rest of the neighborhood, that was to be a campus high school, a high school that would be about 3 times as large as the Madison Park High School that got built. Then that group of people wanted Lower Roxbury to be in the title of their organization. So that was the beginning of the Lower Roxbury Community Corporation. It's interesting that they got more interested in their own history and realized that the major park in the middle of that poor neighborhood was Madison Park, and that was going to be completely destroyed by Melnea Cass Boulevard. And so they decided to change their name to Madison Park Community Corporation in recognition of what was an important piece of geography in their historic neighborhood. Right?
And you were one of the organizers.
I was one of the organizers. Right. I'm famous for a demonstration which Madison Park was a large square park, like Blackstone in the South End. And it was, but during this, in the 60s, it was a very popular place for suburbanites to dump their garbage on their way to work. Because they didn't want to pay dumping fees in their towns. And that's literally, you would literally see these nice cars drive up and people open up the trunk and throw garbage on the ground. And that, of course, encouraged, and the city would hardly ever clean it up. And that encouraged, of course, contractors and other people to also to dump larger garbage. And so the first organizing in that community that led to LRCC was actually to clean the neighborhood up. I was an organizer. We all went around, we knocking on doors. So everybody would complain about the housing, but the number one complaint was the fact that there was so much trash that was not taken up by the city in their neighborhood. So that was our first organizing thing. We built a huge pile of garbage in Madison Park. Madison Park still existed. And we did this big pile of garbage, and the young people decided to burn it down, to set it on fire. And so we let them, and it got tremendous amount of publicity, and led to both the city cleaning up the park, but also the neighbors understanding that organized, they could get some things done. Right?
I want to point out that in the 1960s, late 1960s, the majority of Boston's Black community lived in the South End. Like if you were to look at the geography of the Black community, the geographical center of the Black community would be somewhere like between the South End and Lower Roxbury. I mean, it was what's particularly interesting about that to me is how neighborhood names are to the extent that they're proxies for race and class, they change and the neighborhood reputations change. So that I think it was in the late 90s that people living in 02118 who were in the South End fought and succeeded in getting the name Roxbury dropped from their postal designation. By then, enough of the South End was gentrified that predominantly white that they decided they no longer wanted to be associated with Roxbury. Jamaica Plain was a working class neighborhood in the early 1970s. If you bought a house in Roxbury for $8,000, you'd buy a house in Jamaica Plain for $7,000 or $8,000 as well. But as Jamaica Plain gentrified and became whiter, that's when people began policing those boundaries between Jamaica Plain and Roxbury more strenuously, and also when you would see real estate listings or rentals like saying Jamaica Plain when they're really in Roxbury. What's interesting now is within the last Fort Hill Fort Hill, Highland Park, that section of Roxbury has always been somewhat racially heterogeneous since the 60s, 70s, and 80s. There are always numbers of a good number of white people living up there alongside African Americans and Puerto Ricans. But now the real estate in that neighborhood is way more expensive than elsewhere in Roxbury. It's more highly sought after. And, so that boundary has kind of been moving down to Washington Street. People are claiming things, as part of Fort Hill that, kind of leaves you scratching your head. Roxbury itself, I predict that because the real estate market is so heated in Roxbury to the point where rentals and home prices in Roxbury are higher than in West Roxbury, that I think a lot of the stigma around the Roxbury name is changing. It'll be interesting to see weather and how the borders of Roxbury shift.
And
Now, I think I just want to pick up on Yahoo's statement and that there are agencies in the city who generally recognize the objective boundaries, and so one of them is DPW. So our Department of Public Works, who also puts out the directory of cities to tell you what ward and precinct you're in, wherever you live, right? That directory generally follows the original boundaries. But the other interesting agency is the courts, is our district courts generally follow those boundaries. So I always have to tell people in Jamaica Plain that, of course, when West Roxbury and Roxbury separated, 2/3 of Jamaica Plain went with West Roxbury and the third stayed with Roxbury. And that's probably the most contentious boundary for people is the piece of Jamaica Plain that stayed in Roxbury. But I tell people they have an easy way that they can find out which part of Jamaica Plain they're in, and that's get arrested. If you get arrested in the northern part, you go to the Roxbury court. In the southern part, you go to the West Roxbury court. There's no Jamaica Plain court.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see how many Northeastern students land at Roxbury District Court. Then they find out what neighborhood they're in.
Maddie, did you want to say one more thing? And then I want to start taking some questions from the audience. We've got some really great questions and about 15 minutes left in our.
Yeah, I want to hear these questions, but I will just say, we've been talking about misnomers a lot and incorrect place names. And one time, sometimes a misnomer can be strategic and smart, is when the Charles Street AME Church, when they moved from Beacon Hill down to Roxbury in 1939, they kept the name Charles Street AME Church. Charles Street, as you know, is in Beacon Hill, and the new church is at the intersection of Warren Street and Elm Hill Ave, but they wanted to take that memory of all they'd done since 1876 up on Beacon Hill and take it there. I'm sure people walking by are kind of like, why the hell is this the Charles Street AME Church? But misnomers can be very meaningful.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to try to field as many questions as I can from the audience, and feel free if you still have a question to drop it in right now. An anonymous attendee says, I'm a lifelong and very proud resident of Roxbury, and I believe that the boundaries of Roxbury are shrinking because of perception and racism. Roxbury properly includes the Longwood area, Roxbury Crossing, and the Fenway area. Do you agree? This is something I've heard from my parents, and I've also seen how the news shows that any crime in Boston is labeled in Roxbury when it could be elsewhere. So does that, for all of you, does this perception of a sort of shrinking Roxbury feel accurate? Do you think it's driven largely by negative racialized perceptions of what Roxbury is? And do you see any cases in which, maybe Roxbury is growing or how we're obviously not at the end of history here. How do you maybe think some of these things will change in the future?
I think
I think it's definitely shrinking from not only the objective boundaries, but the boundaries that a lot of us grew up in, defining Roxbury, and that has happened. I would say to the person who asked that question, I think the only way you're going to stop that is to organize. I think that you really need to, the post office is an incredibly difficult bureaucracy around this, and somehow zip codes for the post office has become holy scripture, and they get and they accuse you of blasphemy if you want to change the names of zip codes or the boundaries of zip codes. But there's no reason why we should not pursue this, and it's especially important for institutions to pursue this. Churches should stop allowing people to put them into different neighborhoods that they are not in right now, and that their founders didn't believe they were in, and that also and of course for historians, this causes all kinds of problems when we have institutions like Freedom House, that was an indigenous Roxbury institution, founded by the Snowdens, who were seen as important members of the development of the Black community in Roxbury, and then for them to adopt Dorchester in their address is without having any reference to Roxbury, is just amazingly both disrespectful and just terrible history.
I think that Roxbury's, I'm getting cat bombed here. Roxbury's boundaries, much of the shrinkage happened in recent decades, like in the last 50, 60 years. In the 1950s, Roxbury was still racially heterogeneous. It was, like Roxbury Memorial High School, which is where Latin Academy is now, in the same building, was about 40% Jewish, 40% Black, and the rest of it was like Irish and Italian. So, the neighborhood was more racially heterogeneous, up until the 60s when I was born. Then it was almost nobody white in Roxbury. So that's when I think when it began shrinking was like that, in the 1960s. There were probably, I don't know that Harvard Medical School or the Museum of Fine Arts ever considered themselves to be in Roxbury, but the political boundary is there from when Back Bay was being filled in. The city of Boston had to negotiate with Roxbury what the border would be. And where the Mass Ave Bridge crosses over to Cambridge, was Roxbury. It was on the Roxbury side of that divide. So Fenway Park, all of that is in what's politically Roxbury, and it has shrunk. Nobody there is going to consider themselves part of Roxbury. But again, with who knows how it's going to change. Now you kind of look to your left and look to your right, and you see new people living in your neighborhood who are sort of proudly embracing the Roxbury name. Maybe we'll retake Franklin Park.
There's a question from Reggie, Jean, or John. Sorry, Reggie, if I'm mispronouncing your name. Who works with BU's Upward Bound program, bringing BPS students who live in Roxbury, Dorchester, elsewhere. And this summer, they're looking at climate and sustainable energy. And Reggie asks whether there are some implications of how different Boston neighborhoods are split up and identified, and how those neighborhoods will be impacted by climate change policies and sustainability costs. So as we think about these neighborhoods and being kind of operationalized into climate planning, resilience planning, what might the effects be there?
I think that's a great question, and you can come at it in lots of ways. I mean, I think part of Roxbury's connection to actually very little policies on against climate change is how hot parts of Roxbury are, and because of urban renewal, actually. And then especially the highways that didn't happen, a tremendous amount of trees were destroyed in Roxbury. But going forward, though, I think it is not too soon for people who are living in Roxbury to understand that in 20 years, their land is going to become so valuable, more valuable, because there is going to be no Back Bay. And when there is no Back Bay, where do those people go? They're not going to go live in a village of boats, right? They're going to come to solid high ground, right? And people in Roxbury need to be preparing for that in terms of where their children will be living 20 years from now.
Yeah, somebody told me that I was fortunate because where I live in Roxbury is like about 100 feet above sea level, but I think when you look at climate change from it's interesting because some of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city, like Back Bay, South End, the South Boston waterfront, are will become part of the ocean. soon if everything continues the way it's continuing. But we'll also lose our highways, our public transit system, places where natural gas is delivered, electrical infrastructure, probably the sewer at Deer Island. I think you could say I'm on high ground here in Roxbury, but you might be on an island with no infrastructure. So yeah, I think that we have to, I would hope that that everybody in the city would kind of take a systems approach to looking at climate change. And certainly, yeah, the loss of trees in, what we call Lower Roxbury is definitely contributing to higher temperatures there. And it's something that people fought, when they tried to take down the trees on Melnia Cass Boulevard. It really helped to stop that. However, yeah, I think we're all in this together. We're all in the same boat, as it were.
Maddie, I know your research looks at how kind of different groups of people get credit for caring for the urban environment. Could you say anything more about, thinking about Roxbury as a site of, both you work on historic preservation, but also thinking towards climate resilience and, whose efforts are kind of at the center of public attention there?
Yeah, so that's the thing. I mean, when we look at the history of Boston, I study historic preservation, right? So the people who are counted as preservationists and people who do other sorts of types of civic participation, those people are valued. And we look at Roxbury and a lot of the, as you guys well know, a lot of the different types of headlines that have come out, by the Globe and other newspapers, not the Bay State Banner, are talk about the souring of Sugar Hill, and how sad that Roxbury folks have been taken advantage of in that way. But the key thing and what we're gonna need to see more of as we head forward in this moment of real climate change is what to do with, like what Byron was saying, to create housing for all those people in Back Bay who are gonna be moving somewhere. And something that Roxbury citizens did in a way to combat these big structural forces coming against them was they would take their houses, so their single family houses. I mean, talk about adapting, adapting those single family houses and 2-family houses into multi-family dwelling units to produce more rent that could offset their mortgage costs, their taxes, their maintenance costs. The great former Senator Ed Brooke, he said in his autobiography, the only way he was able to afford to pay off his mortgage and to maintain his home was by continuing to carve up what was originally a 1-family house into 4 units that, they all had light and air. So they were good, stable units. But the reason this is important is that you're going to have to keep reusing things and not just building more housing. And a way to be sustainable is to take what we already have and to reuse it. And I know the city has this additional dwelling unit program, but that Roxbury citizens pioneered that. And we're doing that in the 1940s, 50s, 60s onward. So taking lessons from the past that can be used in the future, whether it's climate change, creating more affordable housing, et cetera, et cetera.
We're almost out of time. So there's actually a cluster of questions that I'm going to try to editorialize into one. And I actually want to do it as a prelude to say that Catherine wrote to me to ask if we'd stay on a little past one just to show a couple of historic maps of Roxbury from the collections, which I'm happy to do for those of you who don't need to leave right at 1 o'clock. And before we think about historic maps, there's a couple of questions that are asking about the way that kind of modern data has made this problem more challenging. Lynn Brown asks about comparing a current BPDA neighborhood map versus what happens when you search Google Maps, where the South End eats up Lower Roxbury, Franklin Field gets added to Roxbury, where does Eggleston belong? Another person asks about, they live in Sugar Hill / Elm Hill, and when they try to enter their address into an online form, like registering their car, paying property taxes, the address gets auto-corrected into Dorchester. And a few other people have asked variants on this question of, now that the computers are evaluating and saying, oh, this point, this address, this place is, according to the data we have, it's not actually in Roxbury. How does that affect, both like our ability to identify new communities or to push back against some of these changes, but also like to figure out who's controlling this, right? You might also think about places like Zillow or real estate companies. How's their data getting used to define these boundaries? Any thoughts about that kind of modern world where, we're not looking at a big classroom wall map of Dorchester, and instead of Roxbury, and instead we're getting mediated by all these digital technologies?
And it might be a little late now, but I do think we need to get an organization that is committed to this, that is made up of Roxbury residents, that does this work. You see, I mean, we had no idea. In the 1960s, we had no idea what effect the naming of zip codes was going to have. But now we know, and we know how difficult it is to change that. And I think we need to get in front of this. And I think that's a great question. But I have to turn it around to our audience. I think we should organize and organize about and get the city to participate in this. And that is, how do we deal with boundaries? So they don't have to be the same. But I do think that that the majority of people should have an opportunity to say where they are and how we, in all the difficult ways there will be, how do we get the people who set them, who have never seen Boston, to set them the way we think they should be set.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of the interesting things is the crowdsourced maps you see where people, say what neighborhood they think they're in. It's fascinating, but I mean, I also think it's really sad though that you still pay a tax for living in Dorchester, on your insurance for your insurers aren't supposed to use zip codes, but they have this sort of arbitrary designation of Boston as being like, a place where your your insurance rates are going to be lower, and Dorchester is a place where your rates are going to be higher. There are some real, I think it'd be really interesting to do for somebody to really sort out what are the extra costs of identifying with any particular neighborhood with Roxbury or Dorchester versus Jamaica Plain or the South End. What are the hidden costs we assume, because of those boundaries that that are oftentimes like people who aren't from Massachusetts even are looking at and using to make decisions.
Great. Well, we're just a little past the top of the hour. So I want to thank our panelists, Byron Rushing, Madeline Webster, and Yahoo Miller, for a really amazing discussion. I apologize to the many questions we didn't get to. We'll certainly ask the BU folks to share them with our panelists. And if you've got contact information, we'll try to reach out. Byron, Maddie, Yahoo, thanks for this. I'm going to stay on just for a little bit to show a couple historic maps of Roxbury from our collection. You should feel free to stay on if you have time, though no obligation. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for this great discussion. I'm really glad that everyone was able to come out today and listen to this, and that Yahoo, Byron, and Garrett were down for this conversation. I'm going to stay on for the maps because I'm really excited.
Great. Well, we'll stick on for maybe 5 or 10 minutes just to see a couple of maps from the collection. I'm going to make sure that I can share my screen here. Oh, you know what? I'm on a new computer that I haven't given Zoom permission to screen share from. Give me a second. You know what, Catherine, if you're on, I need to give Zoom permission to share my screen. So give me 1 second and I'll rejoin. I have to quit the program before it has permission.
We had a map that we used the map that I think you cited, Byron, like when we did an article a few years ago. The map that showed the political boundary in the late 1800s. I'm
back. Sorry about that.
Good starting point.
Can you all see me okay?
We see you.
Good. And here's my screen. So we've got a little over 10,000 maps from our collection here at the center digitized, and you can view them wherever you are, whether you're in Roxbury or Copley Square or on the other side of the globe. I wanted to pull up the Whitney map of Roxbury, which was made in 1843. This is both before West Roxbury is separated from Roxbury proper, and of course before both of those towns are then later annexed into Boston. And just a little bit of kind of orientation here. We're looking at this. North is on the upper right of this map, so it's slightly rotated from what you might be familiar with. Here's Boston on the far right. This is the historic Boston Neck that connected the peninsula of Boston to the mainland. And the kind of reveal here is the BPL's in Roxbury too. Copley Square is also in Roxbury. So the junction of the Providence and Worcester railroads is today's Back Bay train station. So the BPL, I'm sitting right now just a little bit north of that, which, as you can see by this dotted line, is within the historic boundary of Roxbury. So Roxbury stretches all the way from what would become the Back Bay. Over here, you can see the Shirley Eustace House and Eustace Place, and this is the brook that Yahoo referred to. It's called Line Brook in this map because it formed the town line between Dorchester and Roxbury. As we move west, here's the historic village of Roxbury Center, now Lower Roxbury, Nubian Square, sort of the boundary between Lower and Upper Roxbury. You can see all these hatch marks are high mountain, not mountains, but high areas. Those are the Highlands. Here's Seaver Street. So as we go past Seaver Street, we're not in today's Franklin Park. And then we go further and further west all the way into what is West Roxbury. We just passed Forest Hills. This is West Roxbury today, all the way to the Dedham town line. So this is historic Roxbury, a huge area that includes a lot of places like Back Bay and Copley Square. Here's Jamaica Pond, all the way over to the other side of the Brookline town line. This is the historic political entity of Roxbury. And you can get a sense of both how we have these vestigial names, things like Upper and Lower Roxbury, that refer to the geography of the pre-20th century city, but then the discussion that we've had today, how much those have been modified and changed by the different waves of population and people who have lived in Roxbury.
I do want to insert probably the worst political decision that was ever made by the town of, was then the city of Roxbury, was of course Roxbury. Roxbury had most of the Back Bay. The marsh and water in the Back Bay was assigned, and just before it was going to get filled, they worked out a deal, and it all went to Boston. That was in 1859, just before the Civil War.
Yeah,
we lost all that land. We lost all that water that was going to become all that land.
Exactly. And you can, again, to orient people, this cross that's Back Bay train station right now.
Yeah.
The Mill Dam becomes essentially Beacon Street. It's called Gravelly Point. It's about where the Mass Historical Society is, and then to the west. And
where the Christian Science church is. Yeah, but the Mother Church is on Gravelly Point. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, it's right about here-ish.
Yeah.
So these decisions that are made for the economic geography, the political geography of long, long ago, of course, have huge consequences for today. If Roxbury were an independent town, the way Brookline, of course, still is an independent town, even though, it's functionally integrated into Boston, it was never annexed. And you may draw some conclusions about, the sort of class and racial status of the towns that were and were not annexed into Boston over the course of that process.
I want to point out that the first church of Roxbury, which appears at the top of the map, is still there. That's the 1806 building to the left. There is that the one to? No, I think it would be to the left. Yeah.
Right.
It's one of the buildings that survived from colonial Roxbury. What I found interesting with the historical maps is that Blue Hill Ave served as a sort of, once you get past, once you get to Franklin Park, Blue Hill Avenue, what's currently Blue Hill Avenue, is a boundary. And then it splits off from Dorchester along what's now Harvard Street. So yeah, right by the E there in the map, I think is where it kind of splits off so the Franklin Hill housing project, which we all have always considered Dorchester, is part of historical Roxbury.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to jump to one more map in the collection. Oops, wrong one. No, that was the right one. So, then kind of jumping all the way into the 20th century, how Roxbury changes, of course, with the power of the urban renewal state. A lot of the maps that are available are the ones that the BRA and others designed. This comes from the BRA collections we have here. And here you see a much, much smaller Roxbury. This is about 120 years after the Whitney map that I just showed you. And here Roxbury is really this core area, essentially Washington Park and a little bit more, being used by the city to sort of celebrate. The second page of this is, visual kind of cultural tapestry of Roxbury, but the boundaries of its geographic definition have changed enormously.
I think the Boston Redevelopment Authority in their planning maps, which many people use as neighborhood maps,
yeah.
What people miss is that they created the BRA basically created neighborhood designations such as North Dorchester and South Dorchester because the planning areas had to have a certain amount of population in them. So, for instance, Mattapan is such a small section of Dorchester that they expanded it to include Franklin Park.
Yeah.
The Greater Mattapan Neighborhood Association claims Franklin Park in their planning areas. I've had many long heated discussions with them about this, but
and it just goes to, it's such a great illustration, Yahoo, of the way that these boundaries get defined for certain purposes. If we think way back to historic Roxbury, right? Those boundaries were set up for the colonial agricultural practices of the British Empire, right? They were defined for settler colonialism, for people to create a political community in Mass Bay Colony. Then we still have some of the traces of those boundaries with us today. We talked about how the BRA has needed to define areas for administration and for jurisdiction. The post office needs areas that serve to dispatch mail trucks. So the way that these definitions come into reality for a certain purpose, but then oftentimes outlive or end up being used for different purposes over time.
You can't even trust the city. That's the craziest part of it is that, different city agencies have different boundaries. And as Byron mentioned, that the courts, which is not a city agency, but, the courts have like a better definition than most city agencies have.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things about this is that even in the dividing up for a variety of reasons, there's no reason why the original boundaries could not be always under the first layer and then everything built on that, you see. But once you say that you change the name of the geography from Roxbury to something else, you really that is really a political and ideological decision. Yeah.
Great. Well, this has been just an amazing conversation. Thanks once again to Madeline for pulling it together and to inviting all of us, Byron and Yahoo. Just like there couldn't be anyone better to talk about these topics than the two of you. So we're also appreciative that you were able to join us today.
Yeah, thanks for
Thank you. Thank you for pulling it together.
Great. And thanks to our colleagues at BU for administering this, and be sure to tune into the rest of the Institute on Cities online